just gives you a bit more of a specific case study for some of the interrelated pieces here.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, great. Maybe I would like to just open it up for questions though, because my bad when I do these kind of presentations, I get carried away with my own story, and I like listening to your questions and your perspective. So does anybody have anything to share at this stage?
I had a question on food insecurity as of right now with COVID going on. So with the Indigenous community, because of COVID and transportation of goods and not being able to, I guess, have more access to those food, do you think the food insecurity changed because of COVID, or how would have COVID impacted Indigenous community right now?
Well, I think you raise an important issue, and I think we're still not sure exactly on a case-by-case basis, you know, or as a national sort of statistic, what that looks like. But you know, based on my experience, I have two different experiences of working with two different communities in the Northwest Territories. You know, people ended up going back to the land more because there was actually a wonderful program supported by the government of the Northwest Territories to get people out of their community so they weren't kind of coped up in town, and perhaps increasing the likelihood of spread of COVID. So that actually led to almost a improvement in food security in some communities where people had the capacity to go back to the land. In other regions, you know, it would be the same as the statistics for all of Alberta, right? People become unemployed. You know, the shipping and transportation of goods is more problematic, and the cost of food increases. So that, you know, there's kind of a mixed story there.
Okay. Also, I had another quick question. So, I feel like the Indigenous community would have less access to resources like masks. So, is there like a higher chance that some communities might spread COVID faster, but there is no testing available?
Absolutely, yeah, that's a very good point, and that's certainly true in a lot of places. The federal government had, and Health Canada had, you know, a contingency plan after SARS. You know, they were heavily criticized after SARS for not providing enough support, and so there was, you know, basically a plan in place to get masks shipped out as quickly as possible to remote communities. Luckily, knock on wood, everybody to knock on wood at the moment, but there haven't been, you know, a huge spread of cases in Indigenous communities in the north. But certainly those living in urban areas where we already see statistics higher, like in Calgary, etc., people are certainly more at risk.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else want to jump in?
Yeah, actually, I had a question. So we talked a lot about food insecurity issues in Indigenous communities. I was just wondering what solutions would look like if it's policy that needs to be implemented, if it's, you know, more subsidies towards food to make it more affordable, but also looking at like the hunting, how to make hunting more accessible as well. Like if there's changes in I don't know, hunting behavior for people who aren't Indigenous around their communities or anything like that.
Right, right. And as we, Kaylin, again, hitting the nail on the head with your comment, essentially where my presentation is kind of leading is the need for an integrated and more holistic approach to addressing food security. Sort of I've highlighted a whole set of ecological issues, right? In the decline of the caribou, or the extirpation of caribou being one example of a problem. The spread of chronic wasting disease in ungulates here in Alberta, a critical issue. How we manage our fisheries, you know, are we managing fisheries for recreational use? Are we managing, you know, wildlife populations for, you know, outfitting for Americans? or are we managing our lands and resources to ensure the sustainability of those species as well as their value to Indigenous communities? And certainly it's not the latter, and we have a whole set of values and priorities that drive our natural resource management decision making that have nothing to do with respect of Indigenous rights or the well-being of Indigenous people, from my perspective. And I think a lot of people would probably agree, if not in this class, in lots of others. So that's one issue. Certainly, providing, subsidizing food. That there's a number of programs in Northern Canada, especially in the remote communities, the food mail program, and then there's another program that's replaced it to try and create opportunities for people to subsidize the cost of food. But as Kaylin pointed out, we have these strange kind of perverse circumstances of extreme wealth and food insecurity. So Fort Mackay being an example, lovely community, some of the nicest people I've ever worked with. But why in the midst of the oil sands where, there's millions and millions of dollars leaving that area, do we have a community that essentially is food insecure and has no grocery store? How does that work? So there's a whole set of strange, contradictions in how we address, food insecurity, that like low-hanging fruit like that can make a huge difference. And what we've learned from years and decades of research, people like Harriet Kuhnlein, and then Brent assigned a few other chapters for you to read. And I'm part of a really interesting group right now on Indigenous food security with the Food and Agricultural Organization, FAO. A resurgence, a real focus on reclaiming traditional food practices, traditional food resources, and just an incredible kind of movement in that direction that provides not only the food, but also the cultural continuity value, the economic security value, the capacity to pass on knowledge and practices and beliefs to future generations, spiritual practices, etc. So it's tremendously valuable to think about, a more holistic approach and supporting communities in taking control of their own food security or food sovereignty. And, there's individual sort of Band-Aid solutions. Can we, Brent and I both worked with a colleague in another faculty, part of a food program where, try and offset the cost of healthy food by increasing the cost of other food. So an example, subsidies, increase the cost of Coca-Cola in store X and offset the cost of milk. And that's worked to a certain extent, but only where those programs have been community-based and you have, a local organization that is really driving and supporting that kind of food policy approach at the local level. And the other issue is, the lack of integrated approaches, Health Canada versus, the natural resource management organizations or departments, versus some of the other kinds of organizations and departments involved in this holistic picture of food security. There's kind of a misalignment in how we manage, as I said before, how we manage wildlife. I wrote a paper a number of years ago, essentially advocating that wildlife management institutions like co-management boards should include a dimension of food security and human health, rather than just managing the species in this kind of narrow silo or bubble. Recognize that that whether that's a caribou, a moose, a fish stock, is part of this culture, part of a particular community context. Great. maybe I'll just quickly point out through the last few slides, and Kaylin did a great job of stealing my punchline at the beginning, which I love that you did that. Just the point at which, we're looking at the oil sands region and the extent to which, it's a tremendously wealthy region in terms of resources, but we have this odd circumstance of food insecurity. I'll just skip through some of these other slides, but you're welcome to read them afterwards. There's a combined problem there of income inequality, the extent to which, some people are making a great deal of money and able to sustain their livelihoods or sustain their way of life but the cost of living in that region prior to the crash of oil is significant, and so is a real barrier to food security for many people. Kind of highlighted again, levels of poverty that exist and the ways in which poverty, of course, and food insecurity go hand in hand. You can sort of read some of these statistics and find some of your own in terms of looking at median income and also income inequality between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. Anybody take economics? Oh, of course you're taking economics. This is economics. It's usually what I ask in the other classes. Something like the Gini index, right? Where you start to see the tremendous disparity of wealth that exists between countries or within countries. If we were to have a similar kind of Gini index here in, the oil sands region, you'd see the tremendous kinds of disparities that exist in terms of who's benefiting and who is not. It is actually quite interesting too, the number of people that do work around the oil sands or in relation to the oil sands who've actually never been to Fort McMurray. I was shocked the other day, I learned how many people had not been to Fort McMurray, but have been working on, engineers or, been working their whole careers on something to do with the, oil extraction or something else to do with oil sands and had never been to Fort McMurray. So it's a very kind of disconnected sense of how who's benefiting and who is not. Certainly people in place and not benefiting as much perhaps as others. Talked already about loss of access to traditional lands. Important to recognize again, referencing Fort McKay, how much of their traditional territory has been taken up by oil sands mining. There's virtually very, very little left of viable habitat for moose or other, certainly not for boreal caribou. Moose and deer who like edge are actually sometimes more prevalent than you'd think. But just in terms of traditional use area, Mackay has just kind of little pockets here and there, as does Fort Chib, of land that's not disturbed. And again, this represents a problem of food insecurity, but also has this reverberating cultural, spiritual, emotional impact on people's lives. This is a picture, kind of contrary view of from the Gwich'in region near Inuvik, and this is actually bull trout that is hanging there to dry, and the extent to which, comparison of communities where they have lands intact, rights to harvest, abundant resources that are not disturbed or taken up as a result of development. You see huge differences in terms of health and well-being statistically between communities that have access to those resources and their own cultural practices and foods that are important to them, and communities that don't, right? So the answer in Kaylin's question, is a complex one. What is the solution? Finding ways that people can reclaim their rights, reclaim access, reclaim the health of those resources that underpin their culture. I already showed you that picture. Another dimension of the story is also the social piece. the strong social networks that people have with one another, you know, as part of those traditional harvesting practices. Is a family from the K family from Untitled berry picking, and the ways in which, yeah, those practices are part of a healthy family life, a healthy way of life, you know, in addition to the actual food resources. Another sort of interesting kind of spin-off area is, in theory, and something that's critically important, is the issue of cultural continuity. So, you know, reclaiming those practices, being able to sustain one's way of life, food resources from the land, is a practice, you know, that dates back hundreds of years for a lot of communities. And sustaining that cultural continuity isn't just interesting from a National Geographic kind of perspective for those who might think, oh, that's interesting, that guy was caribou hunting, but actually represents, you know, an aspect of psychological well-being. And for those of you who may not be aware, you know, social circumstances or indicators of health in many communities are dire. Indigenous youth, for example, the rates of suicide among Indigenous youth is very high, sometimes 3 and 5 times higher than non-Indigenous population. But on the positive story from this article that I'm citing by Chandler Lalonde is the extent to which communities that are able to practice their traditions, that have basically they did a study with over 200 First Nations in British Columbia, and basically tracking that communities that were able to sustain their cultural practices, you know, indicators of cultural continuity, had far less suicide, if not no suicide, compared to the communities that, you know, were basically struggling in terms of culture, or their culture had been undermined in different ways. So this story really, again, points to the importance of cultural practices, not only for the production of the food resource, but as having reverberating and critical meaning and value to people's lives. And I can send you that reference. Who's responsible? Sometimes we end up talking too much about individual, you know, the personal health behaviors, or you know, we're talking about food security. Well, you should eat more of that yogurt advertised on TV, that probiotic yogurt. It's your fault if you're not healthy and not eating the right food, because look at all this great, interesting stuff, you know, or eat more bran, or protein bars, or the Mediterranean diet, that'll solve everything. But when kind of look beyond that sort of individual lens, we realize the extent to which we blame a lot of food insecurity problems on individuals. They should just eat better. They shouldn't eat that. Or they should get a job and then they could buy healthier food. The extent to which a lot of the narrative, particularly in relation to Indigenous communities, is focused on victim blaming rather than on larger institutional power structures and systems, is critical. And I just realized my son has just come home from school. So I'll pause there and see if people have any questions. And how do we get past victim blaming is sort of where I leave that. And I'll just open the door for my son.
So we just have Brenda for a couple more minutes. So any last questions you have, this would be great time to raise them with her.
I'm not sure, Brent, if this is helpful or not.
Sorry?
I'm not sure if I've touched on the pieces that you hoped I would.
Sure. Can I just ask one thing? There's these different terminologies that we see, and when food security came up as a term, it was in a way, because it didn't say anything about production or where people get their food, it was something that big companies and exporting countries like Canada could try to use to encourage importing countries to buy their food. And so food security had a little bit of was sort of used as a term. Food sovereignty has come up more recently, and you used the word once in this lecture. Well, do you think food sovereignty is a useful concept for kind of first Aboriginal people's context?
I do, and there's lots of people that use food sovereignty, or increasingly looking at food sovereignty as better terminology. It's a better frame because it recognizes, that socio-political dynamic and the extent to which, people controlling their own resources, their own livelihoods, having greater power in those kinds of contexts is critical. It's not just about reducing the price of, milk. It's a whole set of relationships and dynamics that are political, social, etc. So, I don't use it as much for a number of reasons, but it's kind of less. It's sometimes used quite ambiguously, so it doesn't have the same kind of teeth sometimes. If you're talking about in a policy context, and Brent, you might know better than me that, working with different organizations internationally, if you can use terminology that has teeth or is recognized by, say, FAO or the UN, you're sometimes better off than trying to introduce a new concept that people haven't bought into.
Yeah, we've talked about framing in this class, and I think that often food sovereignty is used as a frame for different people promoting different interests, and not necessarily, all that helpful. And sometimes I kind of using it as in a kind of a political way to kind of stake their claim on something, where someone else may actually have a different concept of what food sovereignty might be. But for me, this idea of Aboriginal people having, and in Canada, the Indigenous people having more say over their own food context, including their own food sourcing, and their, and use and food fitting into their social networks and into their customs and to their culture. I think that's much more powerful and meaningful in the Canadian context, in Aboriginal context in Canada, than it is in most places.
Yes, yeah. I would say in a lot of cases as well, there's degrees of effort or degrees of recognition. Harriet Kuhnlein, among others, spent her whole career highlighting the extent to which, food from the land or traditional food systems were more nutritious and also socially, culturally valuable to Indigenous people. But still, we maybe from a grander policy perspective don't necessarily think about, food security and ecosystems as interrelated, right? So we're still kind of looking at, okay, well, if I can lower the price of milk by 7 cents, maybe people would be more food secure. And it's kind of these little Band-Aid, levers that get pulled, rather than, having deeper conversations about why is that caribou herd extirpated, or, why is there no longer access to whitefish and trout in the Lesser Slave Lake region for those communities that live in that area. So, that's my, I guess, interest in, or the area of work I'm in, as you know.
Okay. So are you okay to wrap up now?
Yes.
Okay. Maybe you could shut off your screen, and I want to have the class at least give you a thumbs up or something. What is the equivalent of a round of applause? But it would be nice to get some expressions from students to how much they appreciate your work. There we go. Thank you very much, guys.
Yeah. As I said at the beginning of the lecture, you know, I'm just basically a bystander doing a lot of, you know, very honored to be working with a lot of Indigenous communities in Canada. I'd urge you to, you know, have a look at, you know, there's a number of video links I can send where you actually can hear more specifically from the voices of different communities, whether that's Peltiac people on the West Coast or the Innu from Labrador or people from Nunavut. You can hear specifically their individual stories and learn from that knowledge and place, you know, what's really going on in very specific parts of Canada and then also globally.
I think it would be great to have those individual stories that I could post to the website. I wouldn't expect students to study them, but to deepen their understanding of the issues through those stories. I think it would be great.
Excellent. I can release the share the film that the Indigenous organization working with FAO did recently. That might be useful.
That'd be cool. Okay, everyone. Brenda, thank you so much for joining us and for being willing to share such a broad set of information that you have. I think that helps round things out for us very well, both, you know, the situation here in Canada to deepen our understanding, but also touching upon issues which are, as you said, also more global, things like, you know, rights and duties and how we have things, you know, there's rights on paper, but if you don't have a public agency that actually backs those up, then they don't have the same effect. So I think you've raised lots of important points for us. So thank you very much again.
Great. Well, enjoy the rest of your class and feel free if students are looking for more information. You know, there's a wealth of knowledge in the Faculty of Native Studies as well that I encourage people to reach out for more information.